There is a photograph of Sigmund Freud taken in 1938, 1 year before his death. He is sitting in his study in London, surrounded by his collection. Thousands of ancient artifacts, figurines, statuettes, amulets, carved stones, gathered over a lifetime of obsessive collecting. Egyptian Shabti figures, Roman bronzes, Greek ceramics. The desk in front of him is crowded with them. He worked surrounded by the ancient world every single day of his adult life. This is not a casual detail. This is not the hobby of a man who needed a distraction. Freud spent more than 30 years building one of the largest private collections of ancient artifacts in Europe. He owned over 3,000 objects by the time he died. He referred to his Egyptian figurines as his old and grubby gods. He placed them where he could see them while he wrote. He said they helped him think. And in his final years, in exile, dying of cancer, watching the world he had built being dismantled by the rise of fascism, he wrote a book. Not a clinical study, not a case history, a book about ancient Egypt, about Moses, about the origins of religion, about the deep, buried forces that drive human civilization from beneath the surface of conscious awareness. He called it Moses and monotheism. His colleagues begged him not to publish it. It was too controversial, too speculative, too strange for a man of his scientific reputation. He published it anyway. It was the last major work of his life. Freud was trying to say something he had been circling for decades, something that his own theoretical framework, with all its brilliance, all its precision, all its clinical rigour, had brought him to the edge of, but never quite across. He was trying to say that the map of the human soul he had spent his life drawing was not new, that someone had drawn it before, thousands of years before, in a language so ancient that the modern world had forgotten how to read it. He never said it directly, but the evidence of his life, the artifacts, the obsessions, the final book, the private letters, points in one direction with an almost unbearable clarity. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, the man who gave the modern world its vocabulary for the inner life, had spent his career rediscovering something the ancient Egyptians had mapped in extraordinary detail more than 3,000 years before his birth. The structure of the soul, not as metaphor, not as poetry, as a precise, detailed, functionally accurate description of the forces that operate beneath the surface of human consciousness. Forces that Freud called the id, the ego, and the superego, and that the Egyptian priests called in their own ancient language the ka, the ba, and the ak. 3 layers, 2 civilizations, 3,000 years apart, and a map so similar that once you see the parallel, you cannot unsee it. This is the story of how Sigmund Freud spent his final years approaching the edge of a truth the ancient Egyptians had already written in stone, and what that truth means for everything we think we know about the human mind. To understand what Freud rediscovered, we have to first understand what the Egyptians built, not their monuments, though we will return to those, but their map of the inner world, the architecture of the soul as the Egyptian priests understood and taught it. Because the Egyptians did not believe the human being was a single unified entity. They believed the human being was a complex layered system, a structure of distinct but interconnected forces, each operating at a different level of reality, each serving a different function, each requiring a different kind of attention and cultivation. They mapped this system with extraordinary precision, and at its core were three primary components: the ka, the ba, and the ak. The ka was the vital force, the animating energy, the raw instinctual life power that drives the biological organism. The hunger, the drive, the impulse, the urgency of being alive. The Egyptians depicted the ka with two arms raised upward, as if reaching, grasping, demanding. It was the force that said, I need, I want, I must survive. It was not rational, it was not moral. It was the primal engine of existence. The force that keeps the heart beating and the blood moving, even when the conscious mind is asleep. The ba was the personality, the individual self, the conscious identity that navigates the world, that makes choices, that experiences pleasure and pain, that relates to other people, that carries the name and the face and the story of who this particular person is. The Egyptians depicted the ba as a human-headed bird, a being that could fly between worlds, that existed at the intersection of the material and the spiritual, that was both grounded in the body and capable of moving beyond it. The ba was the self that you recognize when you look in a mirror, the identity that says, I am this person with this history, in this body, making these choices. The ak was the illuminated self, the transcendent aspect, the part of the human being that exists beyond personality, beyond biography, beyond the particular story of this one life. The Egyptians depicted the ak as a shining, luminous being, a crested ibis, a bird associated with the god Thoth, the divine intelligence. The ak was what a person became when they had fully integrated the ka and the ba, when the raw vital force had been disciplined, and the personality had been refined, and the deeper nature had been allowed to emerge. It was the self that does not die, the self that the Egyptians dedicated their entire civilization, their temples, their rituals, their art, their science, to cultivating and protecting. Three layers: ka, ba, ak, instinct, identity, transcendence. Now hold those three words in your mind and listen to what Freud described. Working alone in his consulting room in Vienna 3,000 years later, with no knowledge of Egyptian psychology and no intention of mapping anything but the clinical reality of the patients who sat across from him every day. The id, the ego, the superego, the id, the primitive, instinctual force that operates entirely on the pleasure principle, raw biological drive, hunger, desire, aggression, the urgent demands of the organism, unconscious, irrational, immoral. It does not negotiate, it does not reason, it simply wants. The ego, the conscious self, the identity that navigates reality, that mediates between the demands of the id and the requirements of the external world, that carries the name and the face and the story of who this person is. The self that you experience as I, the superego, the transcendent regulating principle, the internalized voice of the ideal, the force that reaches beyond personal desire towards something higher, that judges, that aspires, that holds the self to a standard beyond mere survival or pleasure. Ka equals id, ba equals ego, ak equals superego. The correspondence is not approximate. It is not metaphorical. It is structural, functional, and precise. Two independent systems, developed 3,000 years apart in completely different cultural contexts, using completely different languages, and arriving at the same three-part architecture of the human soul. This is not coincidence, and Freud, in his private moments, knew it. Freud began collecting ancient artifacts in 1896. He was 40 years old. He had just published his first major work on hysteria. He was at the beginning of what would become the most transformative career in the history of psychology. And something pulled him, powerfully, persistently, in a way he could not entirely explain, toward the ancient world. He started with a few Greek and Roman pieces, then Egyptian shabtis, the small funerary figurines placed in tombs to serve the dead in the afterlife, then more Egyptian pieces, then more. By the end of his life, Egyptian artifacts formed the largest portion of his collection. He kept his favourite pieces on his desk. A small statue of the god Thoth, the Egyptian deity of wisdom, writing and the weighing of the soul, sat directly in front of him as he wrote. Every day for decades. He wrote to a friend in 1931, "I have sacrificed a great deal for my collection of Greek, Roman and Egyptian antiquities, and actually have read more archaeology than psychology." This is an extraordinary statement from the man who invented modern psychology. More archaeology than psychology. He was not exaggerating. But here is what makes this obsession significant beyond mere intellectual curiosity. Freud was not a casual collector. He was a precise, systematic thinker who did nothing without reason. His collecting was connected to his theorizing in ways he articulated in his own writings. He used archaeological metaphor constantly when describing the work of psychoanalysis. He compared the analyst's task to that of the archaeologist, excavating layer by layer, going deeper and deeper, removing the accumulated debris of time to find the original structure buried underneath. He wrote in one of his most famous essays, "Imagine that Rome is not a human habitation, but a psychical entity, in which nothing that has come into existence will have passed away." He was describing the unconscious, the layer of the psyche where nothing is ever truly lost, where every experience, every impulse, every ancient pattern is preserved beneath the surface of conscious awareness. The unconscious as archaeology, the psyche as an excavation site, the analyst as someone who must learn to read what is written in layers beneath the surface. This is not a coincidence of metaphor. Freud chose this image because it was accurate. Because the structure of the psyche, as he had mapped it, genuinely resembled the structure of an archaeological site, with the oldest, most fundamental forces buried deepest, and the more recently developed layers of identity and social adaptation lying above them. And the civilization that Freud kept returning to in his private collecting and in his public theorizing was Egypt. Not Greece, though he collected Greek pieces. Not Rome, though he loved Roman art. Egypt, the civilization that, more than any other in the ancient world, had dedicated itself to understanding and navigating the layers of the human soul. There is a letter Freud wrote to his friend Wilhelm Fliess in 1897, at the very beginning of his exploration of the unconscious, before he had published any of his major theoretical works. He wrote, "I am in fact not at all a man of science, not an observer, not an experimenter, not a thinker. I am by temperament nothing but a conquistador, an adventurer, if you want it translated, with all the curiosity, daring and tenacity characteristic of a man of this sort." An adventurer, a conquistador, someone venturing into unknown territory. But the territory was not unknown. It had been mapped, precisely, carefully, over thousands of years, by a civilization that understood the inner world, with a depth and sophistication that the modern West is only beginning to appreciate. And Freud, surrounded by their artifacts, working in their shadow, was, without fully realizing it, retracing their steps. Here is what the modern world has largely forgotten about ancient Egyptian psychology. The Egyptians did not believe that the conscious mind was the primary reality of the human being. They did not believe that the thoughts you are aware of, the intentions you can articulate, the identity you present to the world represent the full picture of who you are. They believed, and built an entire civilization around this belief, that the conscious self is a small island in a vast ocean of deeper forces, deeper memories, deeper patterns that operate beneath the surface of awareness and that shape human behavior in ways the conscious mind cannot directly observe. This is, word for word, the foundational premise of Freudian psychoanalysis. The Egyptians called the deepest layer of this hidden world the duat, often translated as the underworld, but more accurately understood as the hidden dimension, the invisible realm, the territory that exists beneath the surface of the visible world, and that, in the Egyptian understanding, was more real, more fundamental, more causally powerful than the surface world most people took to be the only reality. Every night in the Egyptian cosmological system, the sun god Ra descended into the duat. He travelled through 12 gates, 12 hours of the night, encountering the forces that lived in the deep. Some of those forces were hostile: serpents, demons, the dissolving power of chaos. Others were allies, ancient powers, stored wisdom, the accumulated energy of the dead, waiting to be renewed. Ra had to navigate all of it, integrate all of it, and emerge transformed at dawn, renewed, reborn, capable of giving light to the world for another day. This is a cosmological story, but the Egyptians encoded their psychological insights in cosmological form. And when you read the story of Ra's nightly journey, not as astronomy, but as a map of the inner world, what you find is a precise description of what Freud called the work of the unconscious. Every night, as you sleep, something travels through your own inner duat. Your dreams are not random noise. They are, as Freud correctly identified, and as the Egyptian priests knew before him, the language of the deeper self. A language in which the buried forces of the Ka speak, in which unresolved conflicts from the past resurface in transformed and symbolic form, in which the deeper wisdom of the Ak occasionally breaks through in images of extraordinary clarity and power. Freud's most famous work is The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1899. In it, he argued that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, the primary means by which the hidden forces of the deeper mind communicate with the conscious self. He developed an elaborate system for reading dream symbols, tracing their hidden meanings, using them as diagnostic tools to understand what was operating beneath the surface of a patient's awareness. The Egyptians had developed precisely such a system more than 3,000 years earlier. The Chester Beatty Dream Book, an Egyptian papyrus dating to approximately 1275 BCE, contains a systematic guide to dream interpretation. It categorizes hundreds of dream symbols, identifies their meanings, and provides guidance on how to respond to the messages the deeper self is sending through the dream. It is, in structure and in purpose, almost identical to the interpretive framework Freud developed in Vienna at the turn of the 20th century. Same system, same insight, same understanding that the dream is the language of the hidden self, 3,000 years apart. And there is something else, something that goes even deeper than the structural parallels. The Egyptian priests did not merely observe the unconscious. They worked with it. They had practices, ritual practices, meditative practices, initiatory practices, specifically designed to help a person navigate the inner duat, to encounter the buried forces consciously, to integrate them, to transform the raw instinctual energy of the ka, not by suppressing it, but by understanding it, accepting it, and redirecting it toward higher purposes. Freud called this process psychoanalysis. The Egyptians called it the preparation of the soul. The goal was the same, the emergence of the Ak, the luminous integrated self, the person who has faced their own depths and been transformed by the encounter. There is an image that appears in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, one of the most reproduced images in all of ancient art, painted on papyrus scrolls, placed inside coffins for thousands of years across the entire span of Egyptian civilization. You have almost certainly seen it, even if you did not know its name. It shows a scale. On one side of the scale sits a feather, the feather of Ma'at, the principle of divine truth, cosmic order, and moral balance. On the other side sits a human heart. And standing before the scale is the god Anubis, the jackal-headed guide of souls, holding the balance carefully, reading the result with absolute precision. This is the weighing of the heart, the judgment of the soul at the moment of death. The Egyptians believed that when a person died, their heart, the seat of consciousness, memory, and moral identity in Egyptian thought, was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. If the heart was heavy, burdened with unresolved guilt, with suppressed violence, with the accumulated weight of a life lived in conflict with his own deeper nature, it would sink the scale. And what waited on the other side of that judgment was dissolution. The heart devoured by the creature Amit, the soul lost, the self annihilated. But if the heart was light, if the person had lived in alignment with Ma'at, had integrated their Ka, cultivated their Bi'ar, and allowed their Ak to emerge, then the heart would balance perfectly against the feather. And what waited on the other side was transformation, entry into the field of reeds, the eternal realm, the life beyond life. This is not mythology in the dismissive sense that modern culture often uses the word. This is a precise psychological model expressed in symbolic form, and the psychology it encodes is one that Freud spent his career developing from scratch. Because what is the weighing of the heart? Translated into psychological terms, it is the confrontation of the self with its own unconscious content. The moment when everything that has been buried, the suppressed desires, the unacknowledged impulses, the unresolved conflicts, the hidden motivations, is brought into the light and examined without defense or denial. The moment of radical self-honesty that the Egyptian tradition believed was the central challenge of a human life. Freud believed the same thing. He called it the lifting of repression, the bringing of unconscious material into conscious awareness. He believed that the neurotic suffering he spent his career treating was at its core the product of a heavy heart, of experiences and impulses that had been denied, suppressed, buried in the duat of the unconscious, rather than faced, integrated, and resolved. And he believed that healing, Genuine healing, not mere symptom management, required exactly what the Egyptian priests described: the willingness to go down into the deep, face what is there, and come back transformed. His entire therapeutic method was a secular version of the weighing of the heart. The analyst's couch replaced the scales of Anubis. The therapeutic conversation replaced the ritual of Mayat. The patient's free associations, the uncensored, unguarded flow of thought that Freud used to bypass the conscious defenses and access the hidden material beneath, was a modern technology for doing what the Egyptian initiatory practices had been designed to do, getting the conscious self out of the way so that what was really there could be seen. And here is what makes this more than an interesting parallel. Freud was aware of it, not fully, not explicitly. He never published a paper saying, "My id corresponds to the Egyptian Ka." But in his private correspondence, in his choice of artifacts, in the obsessive way he returned to Egypt throughout his career, there is evidence of a man who suspected that he was not discovering new territory, who sensed, without being able to say it directly within the framework of scientific respectability, that the ancient Egyptians had been here before him, that the map already existed, that the journey he was asking his patients to make, the descent into the inner duat, the confrontation with the buried self, the weighing of the heart, was a journey that human beings had been making, with guidance and with ritual support, for thousands of years before the invention of the consulting room. In 1934, Freud was 78 years old, living in Vienna, watching the Nazi movement spread across Europe with a combination of horror and analytical fascination. He was Jewish. He was the most famous psychologist in the world. And he was writing a book that he knew would destroy whatever reputation for scientific respectability he had spent his life building. The book was Moses and Monotheism, and its central argument was this: Moses was not a Hebrew. Moses was an Egyptian, a high-ranking Egyptian priest or nobleman, educated in the highest levels of Egyptian sacred knowledge, who had adopted the monotheistic religion of the pharaoh Akhenaten, the heretic king who had briefly replaced the entire Egyptian pantheon with worship of a single divine force, the Aten, the light itself, and who, after Akhenaten's death and the violent suppression of his religion, had carried that knowledge out of Egypt and given it to a group of Semitic slaves as the foundation of what would become Judaism. His colleagues were horrified. His friends begged him not to publish. The book would offend both Jews and Christians. It was historically speculative. It would give his enemies ammunition to discredit everything he had built. He published it anyway, 3 separate times, once in 2 parts in a psychoanalytic journal, and then as a complete book in 1939, the last year of his life. Why? Why would a dying man in exile, with his reputation already under attack, choose to spend his final intellectual energy on this particular argument? Because it was the thread he had been pulling his entire life, and he could not stop. Because Moses and Monotheism was not, at its deepest level, a book about Moses. It was a book about the transmission of hidden knowledge, about how the deepest truths about human psychology and the nature of the soul had been encoded in religious and mythological form by the ancient Egyptians, and had been carried imperfectly, incompletely, but undeniably through the centuries in the religious traditions that descended from them. Freud was arguing in the last book of his life that the roots of the Western understanding of the soul went deeper than Greece, deeper than Rome, deeper than Jerusalem. They went to Egypt, to the priests of Akhenaten, to a tradition of sacred knowledge about the nature of the human being and the structure of reality that was ancient even when Moses was alive. Now consider what this means in the context of everything we have been exploring. Akhenaten's religion was not simply a political decision. The worship of the Aten, the single divine light, was the public expression of a cosmological understanding that the Egyptian priests had held for centuries, that beneath the multiplicity of visible reality there is a single unifying force, a single source, a oneness from which everything emerges and to which everything returns. The Aten was not a god in the ordinary sense. It was not a person, not a being with a face and a story. It was the light itself, the energy itself, the ground of being from which all individual existence arises. And in the psychological framework of Egyptian sacred knowledge, the Ak, the luminous illuminated self, the highest aspect of the human soul, was understood to be, in its deepest nature, a reflection of that same light, a spark of the Aten in human form. When Freud argued that Moses had carried Akhenaten's religion out of Egypt, he was, consciously or not, pointing to the deepest layer of the correspondence he had been sensing his entire life. Not just that the id corresponds to the ka, or that the unconscious corresponds to the duat, but that the ultimate goal of the Egyptian system, the emergence of the Ak, the luminous self, the aspect of the human being that participates in the divine light, is the same goal that Freud's therapeutic work was pointing toward, even when he could not name it in those terms. The goal of psychoanalysis, at its deepest level, is not symptom relief. It is not adjustment to social norms. It is the integration of the full self, the bringing of the ka and the ba into alignment, the emergence of something more complete, more luminous, more real than the defended, fragmented, unconsciously driven person who walks into the consulting room for the first time. Freud called it the strengthening of the ego. The Egyptians called it the awakening of the Ak. Different words, the same destination. There is a story within this story that cannot be ignored, because Freud was not the only one who sensed the Egyptian connection. One of his closest colleagues, the man he called his crown prince, the inheritor of his work, the person he trusted more than anyone else to carry psychoanalysis forward, went further, much further, and in doing so revealed the depth of what the Egyptian priests had actually understood. That man was Carl Jung. Jung broke with Freud in 1912. The split was painful, professionally damaging, and personally devastating to both men. But the reason for the split is crucial to this story. Jung believed that Freud's model of the unconscious was too narrow, too focused on the personal history of the individual, too limited to the biography of the single patient lying on the couch. Jung believed that beneath the personal unconscious, beneath the layer of buried memories, suppressed desires, and unresolved conflicts that Freud had mapped, there was something else, something deeper, something that did not belong to any individual person, but was shared by all human beings, in all cultures, across all of history. He called it the collective unconscious, and he argued that it was structured, that it contained recurring patterns, recurring images, recurring forces that appeared independently and with remarkable consistency in the myths, symbols, religions, and dreams of human beings everywhere. He called these patterns archetypes. Now here is where Egypt becomes essential again. Jung spent years studying the mythological systems of the ancient world. Egypt fascinated him as much as it had fascinated Freud, but for different reasons. Where Freud saw in Egypt the historical roots of Western religion, Jung saw something else. He saw a civilization that had done what no modern culture had managed to do: map the archetypes, name them, give them faces and stories, build an entire symbolic system designed to help ordinary human beings navigate the forces of the collective unconscious in their own inner lives. The Egyptian gods were not primitive superstitions. They were psychological realities given visible form. Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, was the archetype of transformation, of the self that must die to be reborn. Isis, the goddess of magic and restoration, was the archetype of the integrating, healing principle, the force that gathers the scattered pieces and makes them whole. Horus, the solar falcon, the son who avenges his father and reclaims the kingdom, was the archetype of the emerging self, the new identity that arises from the integration of the old. And Set, the god of chaos, of the desert, of violent disruption, was the shadow. Jung's great contribution to psychology was the concept of the shadow, the part of the self that has been rejected, denied, projected onto others, buried in the depths of the unconscious. Set was the Egyptian name for what Jung, 3,000 years later, would call the shadow, the force that must be faced, engaged, and ultimately integrated, not defeated, not destroyed, but transformed through the encounter. Freud mapped the structure of the individual soul. Jung mapped the deeper layer, the collective patterns that all souls share. Together they reconstructed, from clinical observation and theoretical reasoning, what the Egyptian priests had encoded in their mythology, their ritual, their sacred art, and their understanding of the soul's journey through life and death. The Egyptian system was complete. It contained both layers: the personal, Ka, Ba, Ak, and the transpersonal, the gods, the archetypes, the collective forces of the Duat. The modern psychological tradition required 2 generations of genius and a painful break between master and student to rediscover what the Egyptians had understood as a unified system. Freud found the first floor, Jung found the basement. The Egyptians had mapped the whole building, and they had left the blueprints, encoded in hieroglyphs, on the walls of tombs and temples, waiting for someone with eyes to read them. Sigmund Freud died on September 23, 1939, in London. He had fled Vienna the previous year, after the Nazi occupation made it impossible for him to remain. He died of jaw cancer, a condition he had lived with for 16 years, enduring more than 30 surgeries, surrounded by his family and his collection, his Egyptian figurines, his old and grubby gods. He died still working, still thinking, still pulling the thread. In the weeks before his death, he asked his physician to help him end his life. When the pain became too great to bear, he had made this arrangement years earlier. He was precise about it, practical, clear-eyed. On September 21st, the doctor administered morphine. On September 23rd, Freud died. He was 83 years old. He had spent more than 40 years mapping the hidden architecture of the human soul. He had discovered the unconscious, the id, the ego, the superego, the mechanisms of repression and projection and transference. He had created a new language for the inner life, a language that changed forever how human beings understood themselves. And at the end, surrounded by the artifacts of the civilization that had done all of this before him, the question remains, how close did he come to knowing? The answer, we believe, is very close. Close enough that the question is no longer really about Freud, it is about us. Because here is what the parallel between Freud and ancient Egypt ultimately reveals. It is not simply that one brilliant man reinvented the wheel. It is not simply that two cultures independently stumbled onto the same psychological truths. It is something more fundamental, more unsettling, more important. It reveals that the structure of the human soul does not change, that the car, the raw vital force, the engine of biological survival, is the same in a person living in ancient Memphis and a person living in modern New York. That the BI, the conscious identity, the self that navigates the world, the person who experiences joy and grief and confusion and love, is recognizably the same across 3,000 years of human history. That the arc, the deeper nature, the luminous aspect, the self that exists beyond biography and beyond the particular story of this one life, is not a product of any culture or any era, but a permanent feature of what it means to be human. Freud mapped this from below, from the clinical reality of suffering patients, from the careful observation of dreams and symptoms and the strange patterns of human behaviour. The Egyptians mapped it from above, from their vision of the soul's full potential, from their understanding of what a human being could become when the full architecture of the inner life had been developed and integrated. They met in the middle, 3,000 years apart, with no knowledge of each other, arriving at the same map. What does this tell us about the soul itself? It tells us that it is real, that it has a structure that can be discovered, that this structure has been discovered before and will be discovered again by any civilization patient enough and honest enough to look inward with sufficient depth. That the ancient Egyptians were not primitive ancestors who happened to build impressive buildings. They were psychologists of extraordinary sophistication who mapped the inner world with a precision that the modern West is only beginning to catch up to. And it tells us something about ourselves, about the car that drives us from below, the impulses we prefer not to acknowledge, the hunger that does not disappear simply because we do not name it, about the bar we present to the world, the identity we have constructed, the story we tell ourselves about who we are, and about the arc, the deeper self, the luminous aspect, the part of us that the Egyptians devoted their entire civilization to protecting and cultivating and ultimately releasing into the light. Freud spent his final years trying to prove what ancient Egypt already knew about the soul. He did not quite make it across, but he came close enough to show us the direction. The rest of the journey, that part belongs to us. This is Sacred Flame TV. If this opens something in you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because some knowledge, once found, cannot be kept to one person.